My name is Christopher, and at 68 years old, I thought I knew what retirement would look like. After my beloved wife Margaret passed, I invited my son Daniel and his new wife Sophia to live with me in our family home. I wanted companionship and to help them start their lives together. What I got instead was disrespect that grew worse each day. I never expected things to come to such a dramatic head, or that I would need to teach my daughter-in-law the hardest lesson of her life. Where are you watching from today? If you have ever dealt with disrespectful family members, hit subscribe, because respect is something we all deserve no matter our age. After 43 years as an electrical engineer, I had built a good life for myself and my family. The two-story colonial house sitting on 3 acres just outside of Boston had been my dream home, designed with Margaret during our 30th anniversary year. We had spent countless evenings sketching layouts, arguing playfully about whether the master bedroom should face east or west for the morning Sunday. Margaret won that argument, as she did many others, and I was grateful every morning when golden light spilled across our bed. The wraparound porch was my contribution, wide enough for comfortable rocking chairs where we planned to spend our sunset years watching the seasons change. The basement workshop became my sanctuary, filled with tools I had collected over decades. When I retired 6 years ago at 62, I finally had time to use them properly. My routine after retirement was comfortable and fulfilling. Mornings started with coffee on that porch Margaret had loved so much. I would read the newspaper front to back, something I never had time for during my working years. Afternoons were for woodworking projects in my workshop or volunteering at the community center teaching basic electronics to kids. Twice a week, I played chess at the local coffee shop with friends I had known since college. Daniel, our only son, had followed in my footsteps and become an engineer as well, though he specialized in software rather than electrical systems. We had always been close, especially after Margaret passed from cancer 4 years ago. He would visit every Sunday for dinner, and we would talk about everything from politics to the latest technological innovations. I was proud of the man he had become, thoughtful and hardworking just like his mother had been. It was during a business trip to San Francisco that Daniel met Sophia. He called me the very night they met, something he had never done about a woman before. His voice had a lightness I hadn't heard since before his mother died. Sophia worked in marketing for a tech company, and according to Daniel, she was brilliant and beautiful and made him laugh until his sides hurt. Their romance moved quickly. Within 6 months of that first meeting, Daniel brought Sophia to Boston to meet me. Her first impression was positive, a bright young woman with ambitious plans and a warm smile. She complimented the house, asked thoughtful questions about Margaret, and seemed genuinely interested in the stories I shared about Daniel's childhood. I found myself hoping that this relationship would last, that Daniel had found someone who could make him happy. 3 months later, Daniel called to tell me he had proposed, and Sophia had said yes. The wedding was planned for that fall, a small ceremony in a historic hotel downtown. As they made their plans, I could see the joy radiating from my son, and it warmed my heart in ways I cannot describe. On their wedding day, I presented them with Margaret's grandmother's pearls, a family heirloom that had been passed down for generations. Sophia seemed genuinely moved by the gesture, tears in her eyes as she fastened the necklace. After the ceremony, she hugged me tightly and called me Dad for the first time. I felt in that moment that our family was growing in exactly the way Margaret would have wanted. The first few months of their marriage seemed perfect from my perspective. They rented a small apartment in the city, close to both their offices. Daniel would still come for Sunday dinners, now with Sophia, and our conversations flowed easily. Sophia would share amusing stories about her clients, and Daniel would look at her with such adoration that it reminded me of how I had looked at Margaret all those years. I began to see Sophia as the daughter I never had. She was smart and capable, with a quick wit that kept us all on our toes. When she mentioned an interest in gardening, I showed her Margaret's carefully preserved seed collection and gardening journals. She seemed genuinely touched that I would share something so personal. About 6 months into their marriage, Daniel mentioned they were struggling with housing costs in the city. Boston real estate had skyrocketed, and their rent had increased significantly. Watching them stress over finances troubled me. My house had 4 bedrooms and more space than one man could possibly need. The decision seemed obvious and right. I invited them to move in with me. The house was paid off, with plenty of room for all of us to have our privacy. Daniel could take over the master bedroom with Sophia, and I would move into the guest room downstairs that had been converted into a study years ago. I presented it as a temporary arrangement until they could save for a place of their own. But secretly, I welcomed the idea of having family filling the house again. Daniel was hesitant at first, concerned about imposing on me. But Sophia surprised me by immediately embracing the idea, calling it the perfect solution. She talked about how we could update some of the decor together, making it feel fresh while respecting the history of the home. I was touched by her enthusiasm and willingness to blend her life with ours. The day they moved in, I felt hopeful for the first time since Margaret died. The house echoed with voices and footsteps again. Boxes piled in the hallway, new clothes hanging in closets that had been half empty for too long. I believed we were starting a new chapter that would bring happiness to all of us. The change in Sophia was so gradual that at first I wondered if I was imagining things. It started with small comments about the house, delivered with a smile but carrying a sting I couldn't quite ignore. "You know, Christopher, these curtains must have been fashionable when Nixon was president," she said one morning over breakfast, pulling at the fabric Margaret had chosen with such care. I laughed it off, but the comment lingered. The curtains had been Margaret's favorite, a soft blue pattern that caught the light in ways that had delighted her. I hadn't thought to change them, hadn't wanted to erase another piece of my wife from our home. Within weeks, those curtains disappeared, replaced with modern white panels that let in more light but felt sterile and impersonal to my eyes. When I mentioned it, Sophia seemed surprised by my reaction. "I thought you'd appreciate the update," she said. "The old ones were gathering dust and making the place look dated. It wasn't just the curtains." Week by week, the house began to transform. The comfortable, well-worn furniture in the living room vanished while I was volunteering one afternoon, replaced by sleek leather pieces that looked impressive but felt cold against my skin. The family photos that had lined the hallway were rearranged, with several of Margaret and me in our younger days relegated to a box I later found in the attic. I tried to be understanding. This was Sophia's home now, too, and she had a right to make it comfortable for herself. But the changes happened without discussion, as if my opinion on the home I had built and lived in for decades didn't matter. When Daniel was around, Sophia was unfailingly pleasant to me, touching my shoulder affectionately or asking about my day. But as Daniel's work hours grew longer, Sophia and I were often alone together, and those were the times when her mask seemed to slip. If I left a coffee cup on the side table, she would sigh dramatically before taking it to the kitchen. If I tracked a bit of dirt in from the garden, she would appear with a vacuum cleaner while I was still removing my shoes. Small irritations that she made sure I noticed, but nothing significant enough to complain about without seeming petty. Daniel had been promoted to project lead at his company, which meant longer hours and occasional weekend work. I was proud of his success, but concerned about the strain it seemed to place on him. Dark circles formed under his eyes, and his usual enthusiasm dimmed. When I asked if everything was all right, he assured me it was just temporary pressure, that things would calm down after the current project launched. With Daniel working so much, I thought Sophia might appreciate company and attempted to build a relationship with her through cooking. Margaret had taught me a few specialties over the years, and I offered to show Sophia how to make her famous pot roast one Sunday when Daniel was caught at the office. At first, she seemed interested, watching as I prepared the vegetables and seared the meat. But as I explained Margaret's technique for getting the perfect gravy, I noticed Sophia checking her phone, barely listening. "No offense, Christopher, but that seems like an outdated way to cook," she interrupted. "I found a recipe online that uses a pressure cooker. It's much faster and probably healthier." I smiled and nodded, trying not to show how much the dismissal of Margaret's methods hurt. It wasn't about the recipe itself, but the memories attached to it. the Sunday afternoons with Margaret humming as she cooked, the knowledge passed down that I had hoped to share. More troubling were Sophia's subtle put-downs of family traditions. When I mentioned the annual fishing trip Daniel and I had taken since he was 10, she rolled her eyes. Daniel mentioned that tradition. Honestly, it sounds boring, sitting in a boat all day catching nothing. I think he's outgrown it but doesn't want to hurt your feelings. The comment confused and hurt me. Daniel had always seemed to enjoy our trips, even as an adult. Had he been pretending all these years? I didn't bring up the trip again, not wanting to pressure him if his interests had indeed changed. As winter approached, I looked forward to decorating for Christmas, as we had always done. The Friday after Thanksgiving had always been our day to bring down the ornaments from the attic, each one holding decades of memories. But when I mentioned it to Sophia, she informed me that she had already ordered new decorations. "Those old ornaments are a bit kitschy, don't you think?" she said. "I found a beautiful minimalist theme online that will look so much more sophisticated." I felt a lump form in my throat but swallowed it down. They were just things, I told myself, not worth creating conflict over. But as each tradition was dismissed or altered, I felt Margaret slipping further away, along with the home we had built together. The final straw of this early period came during a dinner with one of Daniel's colleagues and his wife. The conversation had turned to retirement, and the colleague asked about my experiences. Before I could answer, Sophia jumped in. "Oh, Christopher spends most of his time puttering around. You know how old people get, they need their routines." The table went silent for a moment. I was 68, certainly not young, but not senile or incapable. The casual dismissal stung, especially as Daniel said nothing to contradict her, just changing the subject to a recent sports game. Later that night, as I lay awake in my new bedroom that still didn't feel like mine, I wondered if I was being too sensitive. Perhaps generational differences were at play, and I needed to be more flexible, more understanding of a younger perspective. Or perhaps I was facing a slowly growing problem that I didn't know how to address. By the time spring arrived, the subtle tensions had grown into something more concerning. Sophia began inviting friends over without telling me, something that wouldn't have bothered me if not for how they treated my home and me when they visited. I returned early from a doctor's appointment one Tuesday to find 6 women in my living room, wine glasses in hand, lounging across furniture as if they owned the place. My entrance seemed to surprise them, but not enough to inspire any greetings or introductions. "Oh, this is Daniel's father," Sophia said dismissively when one woman finally asked who I was. "He lives here too. Not he owns the home." Or, "This is Christopher." Just an afterthought, a footnote in the story of what was once unquestionably my house. Her friends treated the space as their own private venue, leaving glasses on wooden surfaces without coasters, dropping crumbs on the carpet and walking away. When I quietly placed coasters under their drinks, one woman laughed. "So your father-in-law is the housekeeper?" she asked Sophia, loud enough for me to hear from the kitchen. "He needs to feel useful," Sophia replied, her voice lowered but still audible. "Just let him do his thing." I retreated to my workshop that day, hurt and confused by how things had evolved. The basement had remained my sanctuary, the one place Sophia showed little interest in altering, probably because it wasn't visible to her friends. But even that space was beginning to feel different. Tools I had organized meticulously for decades would be slightly out of place, as if someone had used them without permission. My collection of specialized wood clamps, arranged by size along one wall, appeared in disarray more than once. When I asked Daniel if he had been using them, he looked genuinely confused. Some of my personal items began disappearing from common areas of the house. A clay paperweight Daniel had made for me in 3rd grade vanished from the desk in the study. The antique fishing lures my father had given me, displayed in a small shadow box on the mantel, were removed to make way for an abstract sculpture Sophia had purchased. When I asked about these items, Sophia always had an explanation ready. "Oh, those old lures were gathering dust," she said. "I put them somewhere safe. I'll look for them this weekend." The weekend would come and go with no mention of the lures. And eventually, I stopped asking. choosing instead to quietly search the house when no one was home. I found many of my displaced treasures in boxes in the attic, some damaged from careless handling. The discovery brought a pain I hadn't expected, a sense of being systematically erased from my own home. Dinners became a battleground of subtle conflicts. Sophia began complaining to Daniel about what she called my mess and my outdated ways. "Your father left his newspaper all over the couch again," she would say, though I had simply stepped away to answer the phone. And the smell from whatever he was cooking in the slow cooker all day was overwhelming. "Maybe we should talk about separate kitchen times?" Daniel, exhausted from long work hours and caught between his wife and father, became visibly stressed by these exchanges. The light that had returned to his eyes when he met Sophia dimmed again. Lines appeared around his mouth that reminded me painfully of my own face after Margaret's diagnosis, when worry became my constant companion. I tried to minimize conflicts by keeping to myself more, eating dinner earlier or later than the young couple, limiting my presence in common areas when Sophia was home. But the strategy only seemed to embolden her. One afternoon, I overheard Sophia on the phone with a friend while I was bringing in groceries through the side door. "I can't wait to update this old man's cave," she was saying. "Once we inherit this place, the first thing to go will be that hideous workshop. Think of the spa we could put in that space. The casual certainty that my home would eventually be hers, the dismissal of the workshop that had been my refuge, left me cold. I set the groceries down quietly and left the house, driving aimlessly for hours until I could compose myself. When I returned, Sophia was planning dinner, acting as if I didn't exist. No mention of where I had been or if I would be joining them. I realized with a sinking feeling that she hadn't even noticed my absence. Dinner plans and family decisions increasingly excluded me. I would come downstairs to find notes about Daniel and Sophia having dinner with friends. No invitation extended. Holidays were planned without my input, despite them taking place in my home. When I mentioned taking our usual Memorial Day weekend trip to the lake house, a tradition for 20 years, Sophia already had other plans in motion. "Oh, we've already committed to a weekend in the Hamptons with my college friends," she said. "You don't mind having the house to yourself, do you? It will be good for you to have some alone time." The isolation grew heavier each day. Friends I had invited over for decades suddenly felt uncomfortable visiting. The comfort and openness of my home had been replaced with an atmosphere of tension that no one wanted to endure. I found myself accepting more invitations to others' homes instead, grateful for spaces where I still felt welcome. The breaking point of this phase came when I returned from a weekend chess tournament to find my workshop completely rearranged. The careful organization system I had developed over years was gone. Tools hung in new locations, lumber stacked in different configurations, and worst of all, several projects I had been working on were nowhere to be found. For the first time, I confronted Sophia directly, my voice tight with anger I could no longer suppress. What happened to my workshop? And where are the birdhouses I was building for the community center auction? Sophia seemed surprised by my reaction, her expression one of innocent confusion that I no longer believed. "It was a mess down there," she explained. "I hired a professional organizer while you were gone. It's much more functional now. And those little wood projects were cluttering the space, so we moved them to make room. I'm not sure where they ended up." "They weren't little wood projects," I said, struggling to keep my voice level. "They were donations for a charity auction happening next week. I promised a dozen birdhouses to help raise money for the Children's Hospital." Daniel walked in during this exchange, and I expected him to see the situation clearly, to understand why this invasion of my private space crossed a line. Instead, he tried to mediate, his response weak and non-committal. "I'm sure the organizer meant well, Dad," he said. "And we can find the birdhouses. They must be around somewhere." Sophia seized on his tentative support. "I was just trying to help," she added, her voice taking on a wounded quality. The basement was a safety hazard with all that clutter. Someone could get hurt down there. I had maintained that workshop meticulously for decades without a single accident. The accusation that I had created a hazardous environment was the final insult. I looked at my son, hoping to see recognition of the unfairness, but his eyes slid away from mine, unable to hold my gaze. In that moment, I realized Daniel was no longer the mediator in this household conflict. He had chosen his side, and it wasn't mine. My 68th birthday arrived on a perfect June day, the kind Margaret would have celebrated with a picnic in the garden she had lovingly tended. I woke with memories of past birthdays, the small traditions that had made them special. Margaret always left a card on my pillow to find when I woke. Daniel, even as an adult, would call first thing in the morning to wish me happy birthday, a habit that started when he was away at college. That morning, my pillow was empty, and my phone remained silent. I told myself that Daniel was busy, that he would remember later. I made my coffee and sat on the porch, watching the neighborhood come to life as the sun climbed higher. By evening, it became clear that my birthday had been forgotten, or worse, ignored. I heard Daniel and Sophia in the kitchen discussing dinner plans that clearly didn't include me. "We should try that new Thai place downtown," Sophia was saying. "I heard the curry is amazing." "Sounds good," Daniel replied. "Let me just change out of my work clothes." I stood in the hallway, unsure whether to make my presence known, when Sophia noticed me. "Oh, Christopher," she said, without a trace of recognition that the day was significant. "We're heading out for dinner. There's leftover pasta in the fridge if you're hungry." They left without another word, the door closing behind them with a finality that echoed through the empty house. I sat alone at the kitchen table, a single candle stuck in a muffin lid bought myself at the corner bakery. The small flame flickered in the dim light, casting shadows that seemed to emphasize the emptiness surrounding me. Later that week, I ventured into the attic looking for a book Margaret had loved, thinking reading her favorite passages might bring some comfort. What I found instead were dozens of boxes filled with photographs, mementos, and personal items that had once been displayed throughout the house. Our wedding album, the collection of seashells from our 20th anniversary trip to Maine, the handmade quilt Margaret's mother had given us, all of it carefully packed away, as if preparing for my departure or death. As I opened box after box, the realization dawned that I was being systematically removed from the home I had built, my presence erased room by room. One box contained all the photographs of Margaret that had once lined the hallway, her smiling face now hidden in cardboard darkness. I sat among the boxes, one of her photos in my hand, and felt a grief as fresh as the day she died, not just for her absence, but for how quickly the life we'd built together was being dismantled. I was still sitting there, surrounded by the boxed remnants of my life, when Daniel found me hours later. "Dad? What are you doing up here?" he asked, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. I gestured to the boxes without speaking, my throat too tight for words. Daniel had the grace to look embarrassed as he surveyed the scene. "Sophia thought it would be good to update the decor," he said weakly. "She didn't throw anything away." The justification felt hollow, an excuse that acknowledged no wrongdoing. I finally found my voice. "This isn't decor, Daniel. This is our life. Your mother's life." He knelt beside me, picking up a framed photo of the three of us at his high school graduation. For a moment, I thought I saw recognition in his eyes, a understanding of what had been lost. But then his expression closed again. "Things change, Dad. We can't live in a museum." The words stung more coming from him than they ever could from Sophia. This was my son, who had grown up in this house, who had 40 years of memories woven into its walls. Yet he dismissed those memories as if they were an inconvenience, an obstacle to progress. The next blow came 3 days later, delivered with what Sophia probably thought was compassion. She and Daniel sat me down in the living room after dinner, their expressions serious in a way that immediately put me on guard. "We've been thinking," Sophia began, her voice gentle but firm. "Your memory seems to be slipping lately, and this big house is a lot for anyone to manage." My memory was fine. I sometimes forgot where I'd set down my reading glasses, but no more than I had in my 50s. The implication was clear, though, and Daniel continued where she left off. "There's a really nice retirement community just 20 minutes from here," he said. "We toured it yesterday. They have independent living apartments, activities every day, and nursing care if it ever becomes necessary. The betrayal cut deep. They had toured a facility without discussing it with me, made plans for my future as if I were a child incapable of making my own decisions. "So, you want to put me in a home?" I said flatly, not bothering to hide the hurt in my voice. "It's not like that," Daniel protested. "It's a community. You could make friends your own age, have people to talk to." The implication that I had no friends, that I needed to be among other elderly people to be understood, was another wound. I had a rich social life outside this house, one that had been intentionally constrained by the atmosphere Sophia had created. "I think it would be better for everyone," Sophia added, her true meaning transparent beneath the considerate facade. Better for her, mainly. Better for her plans for my home. The discussion continued, with them presenting brochures and talking about amenities as if they were offering me a vacation rather than exile from my own home. I sat silently, nodding occasionally, unable to articulate the depth of my pain and anger in that moment. After they left, convinced they had planted the seed that would eventually bloom into my willing departure, I walked through the house that no longer felt like mine. Every corner held memories that were being systematically erased or boxed away. In the garden, I stood among the roses Margaret had planted, their summer blooms heavy with fragrance in the evening air. It was there, among her flowers, that I contemplated my options. I could acquiesce, move to the retirement facility, and watch from a distance as my home was transformed beyond recognition. I could fight back openly, creating conflict that would further strain my relationship with Daniel. Or I could find another way, a path that preserved both my dignity and my home. As I considered these options, I remembered a letter Margaret had written to me before she died, one of several shed left to comfort me after she was gone. I retrieved the letter from my bedside drawer, its paper soft from multiple readings over the years. Among her words of love and encouragement was a passage that seemed particularly relevant now. "Always remember that standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. Don't let anyone diminish you, Christopher. Not even those you love, especially not those you love." Margaret's wisdom, reaching across years and beyond death, steadied me. I slept that night with her letter under my pillow, drawing strength from her words and the knowledge that she would have understood exactly what I was facing. The following week brought another humiliation. I overheard Sophia and 3 of her friends in the kitchen discussing renovation plans for my house as if I weren't present, though I sat just around the corner in the living room. "Once we get rid of that hideous wood paneling in the den, we can turn it into a proper home office," Sophia was saying. "And the master bathroom needs a complete overhaul. I'm thinking a rainfall shower, marble countertops." The casual way she discussed dismantling rooms I had carefully designed with Margaret was breathtaking in its entitlement. One of her friends asked about timing. "How long before you can start the renovations?" she asked. Sophia sighed dramatically. "We need to wait until Christopher moves out. We're working on convincing him a retirement home would be better for him. Daniel thinks he'll agree by the end of summer." The stress of these weeks began to take a physical toll. I developed insomnia, lying awake for hours listening to the creaks and sighs of the house I'd known intimately for decades. My appetite diminished, and I lost weight that I couldn't afford to lose, my clothes hanging loose on my frame. Eventually, the lack of sleep and proper nutrition caught up with me. I came down with a severe cold that quickly developed into bronchitis. The doctor prescribed rest and fluids, advising me to stay in bed for at least 2 days. Those days of illness became a turning point. Confined to my bedroom, weak and feverish, I had time to think clearly about my situation, without the daily distractions of navigating tensions in the house. I realized that I had been allowing myself to be treated poorly out of love for my son and a desire to avoid conflict. But that approach was failing everyone, including Daniel, who was watching his father be diminished day by day. On the 2nd day of my illness, the final catalyst occurred. I was dozing fitfully when my bedroom door burst open without a knock. Sophia stood in the doorway, her expression thunderous, not a trace of concern for my health visible on her face. Sophia stood in my doorway with her hands on her hips, her face flushed with anger. I was propped up on pillows, still weak from the bronchitis, a half-empty glass of water and my medication on the bedside table. "Seriously, Christopher?" Her voice was sharp enough to make me wince. "You've been in bed for 2 days now. The gutters are overflowing, the lawn hasn't been mowed, and the kitchen sink is leaking again." I tried to speak, but my throat was raw from coughing. She didn't wait for my response anyway, taking my silence as permission to continue her tirade. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she said, pacing across my room as if she owned it. "You can't maintain this house anymore. It's falling apart, and you're just lying here doing nothing about it." Her words felt like physical blows. I'd been prescribed bed rest by my doctor, something Daniel knew but apparently hadn't communicated to his wife. Or perhaps he had, and she simply didn't care. "I think you're being absolutely useless right now," she continued, her voice rising. "Get up and do something. Fix this place. Daniel and I both work full-time. We don't have the energy to maintain your house on top of everything else." I noticed her specific phrasing, "your house," a rare acknowledgement of ownership that only emerged when responsibilities were being discussed, never when decisions were being made. My silence seemed to further infuriate her. She stepped closer to the bed, her voice dropping to a harsher, more intimate tone. "You know what I think? I think you're using this so-called illness to get attention, to make Daniel feel guilty because he suggested the retirement community. Well, it's not working. If anything, this proves our point. You can't take care of yourself, let alone this house." I stared at her, truly seeing her for perhaps the first time. The beautiful, charming woman who had captivated my son was gone, replaced by someone calculating and cold. Or perhaps she'd always been this person, and the charm had been the mask. "I'm tired of walking on eggshells around you," she continued. "Tired of pretending that your outdated tastes and habits aren't driving me crazy. This house is stuck in a time warp, and frankly, so are you." Her cruelty was breathtaking. I had never spoken to anyone the way she was speaking to me, certainly not someone who was ill and vulnerable. "You know what?" She was fully ranting now, gesturing wildly. "Soon this will be my house anyway. Daniel is your only child, your heir, which makes this place eventually mine to do with as I please. So you might as well accept that things are going to change around here, whether you're on board or not." The door opened wider, and Daniel appeared, catching only the tail end of his wife's speech. He looked between us, confusion and concern crossing his face. "What's going on?" he asked, moving to my bedside. "Dad, should you be sitting up? The doctor said you need to rest." Before I could answer, Sophia jumped in. "Your father seems to think his minor cold exempts him from all responsibility around here. I've been telling him that the house is falling apart while he lies in bed." Daniel's expression shifted, discomfort replacing concern. He clearly didn't want to be caught in the middle of this confrontation. "Sophia, he's actually pretty sick," he said tentatively. "The doctor said it could become pneumonia if he doesn't rest." She made a dismissive sound. "Everyone gets colds, Daniel. The gutters still need to be cleaned regardless." I watched my son, saw the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to defend me. I could see that much, but he also didn't want to challenge his wife directly. He was looking for the path of least resistance, a way to appease both of us. "I'll take care of the gutters tomorrow," he said finally, "and he'll look at the sink. Dad needs to recover." It was a weak defense, but at least it was something. Sophia looked momentarily thwarted, but she quickly recovered. "Fine. You work all week, and then spend your weekend doing house maintenance. That seems fair." She directed her gaze back to me, her eyes cold. "This is exactly why we need to talk about more permanent arrangements. This house is too much for your father, and it's unfair to expect you to pick up his slack." I had remained silent throughout this exchange, partly due to my sore throat, partly from shock at the naked hostility Sophia was displaying. But something in me had shifted during her tirade. The sick feeling in my stomach wasn't just from the bronchitis anymore. It was from the realization that things would never improve if I continued my passive approach. I cleared my throat painfully and spoke, my voice raspy but steady. "I'd like to have a family meeting tomorrow at 10 in the morning. In my study," I said. "There's something important we need to discuss." Sophia looked triumphant, clearly believing I was ready to capitulate to their retirement home suggestions. Daniel just looked relieved that the immediate confrontation was diffused. "About the retirement community?" Sophia asked, not bothering to hide her eagerness. "Because we've already put down a refundable deposit to hold a unit." The presumption stole my breath for a moment. They'd already put down a deposit, making decisions about my life without even consulting me. "Among other things," I said vaguely, not wanting to show my cards just yet. "Great," Daniel said quickly. 10 o'clock tomorrow. We've all got some things to discuss." After they left, I lay back on my pillows, exhaustion washing over me. But beneath the fatigue was a new sense of resolve. Margaret had always told me I was too accommodating, too willing to keep the peace at the expense of my own needs. Tomorrow, that would change. I spent that night reviewing documents in my study, making phone calls to my attorney, and preparing for the confrontation to come. I didn't sleep much, but the time was well spent. By morning, I felt armed with both information and determination. I also took the precaution of setting up my phone's voice recorder before Daniel and Sophia arrived for our meeting. Maryland was a two-party consent state for recordings, which meant I couldn't legally record them without their knowledge if I intended to use it in court. But I had no such intentions. This was for my own protection and clarity, a way to make sure I wasn't misremembering or exaggerating what was said in the heat of the moment. As the grandfather clock in the hall struck 10, I heard Daniel and Sophia coming down the stairs. I was seated behind the desk in my study, a position I had chosen deliberately. This was not a casual family chat. This was a reckoning. My study had always been my sanctuary, the place where I made important decisions and handled family business. The heavy oak desk that had belonged to my father anchored the room, its surface now covered with neatly arranged documents. Family photos lined the bookshelves, a visual reminder of the history and relationships at stake in this conversation. Daniel and Sophia entered at precisely 10, and I gestured for them to take the two leather chairs positioned across from my desk. Sophia looked impatient, already glancing at her watch as if she had more important places to be. Daniel seemed nervous, his fingers drumming an anxious rhythm on the arm of his chair. "Thank you for meeting with me," I began, my voice stronger after another day of rest. "I appreciate your time this morning." The formality of my tone caught their attention. This wasn't the accommodating father and father-in-law they'd grown accustomed to over recent months. "As you both know, I've been giving serious thought to the future," I continued. "About this house, about our living arrangements, and about what would be best for everyone involved." Sophia leaned forward, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She clearly thought this was going her way, that I was about to announce my decision to move into the retirement community they'd selected. I placed my hands flat on the desk, deliberately making eye contact with each of them before continuing. "Before we discuss any potential changes, I think it's important that we're all clear on the current situation, the legal and financial reality of where we stand." Daniel's brow furrowed slightly. "What do you mean, Dad?" I slid a document across the desk toward them, the property deed for the house, with my name clearly listed as the sole owner. "This house has never been in joint ownership with Daniel," I said calmly. "When your mother died, Daniel, her half of the property transferred to me, not to you." Sophia stared at the document, the smile fading from her face. "Of course we know you own the house, Christopher," she said, a note of uncertainty creeping into her voice. "That's never been in question." I nodded, acknowledging her statement. "Yet you spoke yesterday as if this house would automatically become yours when I either move out or pass away. You said, and I quote, 'Soon this will be my house anyway.'" Her cheeks flushed, but she maintained her composure. "Well, naturally it will pass to Daniel eventually, as your son and heir. That's just how inheritance works." I reached for another document, This one my current will and estate plan, and placed it beside the deed. Actually, that's not how inheritance works in this case, I explained. My will specifies that this house will go into a family trust upon my death, with Daniel as a beneficiary but not the owner. The trust has specific conditions about how the property can be used and sold. This was a change I'd made 6 months earlier, after witnessing the first signs of Sophia's true character. My attorney had advised the trust as a way to protect the property for future generations, including potential grandchildren, while still providing for Daniel. The color drained from Sophia's face as she processed this information. Daniel looked confused, trying to understand the implications. A trust? But why, Dad? Wouldn't it be simpler to just leave everything to me? I smiled at my son, feeling genuine sympathy for his position. He had been caught between two people he loved, manipulated in ways he probably didn't even recognize. The trust protects our family legacy, Daniel. It ensures that this house, which your mother and I built together, remains in the family for generations. It can't be sold without agreement from the trustees, which include yourself and your cousin Michael. Sophia was now visibly agitated, her carefully constructed plans crumbling before her eyes. "This seems unnecessarily complicated," she said sharply, "and frankly, a bit untrusting. Daniel is your son. It's not about trust or distrust," I replied evenly. "It's about protection and preservation. Many families use trusts for exactly this purpose." I paused, watching her expression shift between anger and calculation as she tried to find a new angle. Before she could respond, I reached for my phone and pressed play on the recording I'd prepared. Sophia's voice filled the room, harsh and clear. "Soon this will be my house anyway. Daniel is your only child, your heir, which makes this place eventually mine to do with, as I please." Her face went pale, then flushed deep red as her own words condemned her. Daniel turned to look at her, shock evident in his expression. He had missed this part of her tirade the day before, entering only in time to hear her complaints about house maintenance. "I never said that," she stammered, trying to recover. "You're manipulating the recording." I pressed another button, and her voice continued. "This house is stuck in a time warp, and frankly, so are you. I think you're being absolutely useless right now." Daniel stood abruptly, his face a mask of disbelief. "Sophia, did you really say those things to my father while he was sick?" Sophia looked trapped, her eyes darting between Daniel and me as she searched for an escape route. "It was taken out of context," she protested. "Your father has been difficult to live with. You know that. He refuses to change anything, to modernize. It's like living in a museum dedicated to your mother." Daniel flinched at the casual disrespect toward his mother, another piece of the puzzle falling into place for him. "Dad has been nothing but generous to us," he said quietly. "He gave us a place to live, asked for nothing in return except basic respect." The simple truth of his statement hung in the air between us. Basic respect. It was all I had ever wanted, yet it had become too much to ask. I cleared my throat, drawing their attention back to me. "I want to be very clear about something. I'm not asking either of you to leave. This is still your home, Daniel, as it always has been." I turned my gaze to Sophia, making sure she understood the distinction. "What I am asking for is respect. Respect for my home, my belongings, and my position in this family. If we continue to live together, there need to be clear boundaries and expectations on all sides." Sophia opened her mouth to protest, but Daniel silenced her with a look. I realized with a surge of hope that perhaps my son was finally seeing the situation clearly, without the filter Sophia had created. "That's more than fair, Dad," he said, sitting back down and leaning toward me. "What kind of boundaries are you thinking of?" I had given this considerable thought during my night of preparation, and I laid out my terms calmly and clearly. First, no more unilateral decisions about the house or its contents. Any changes need to be discussed and agreed upon by all of us. Second, my personal spaces, the workshop, my bedroom, and this study are private and should not be entered without permission. Third, Family heirlooms and mementos stay where they are, or are discussed before being moved. Daniel was nodding as I spoke, the reasonableness of these requests evident. Sophia sat rigid in her chair, her plans for dominance clearly derailed. Most importantly, I finished. We treat each other with the respect due to family members. No more comments about my age, my usefulness, or my capacity to make decisions for myself. The silence that followed was broken by Daniel. "I owe you an apology, Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have noticed what was happening, should have stepped in sooner." His recognition of the situation lifted a weight from my shoulders. I hadn't lost my son after all. Sophia, seeing her position weakening by the second, attempted one last manipulation. "Daniel, he recorded me without consent," she said, reaching for his arm. "That's probably illegal. Hess trying to drive a wedge between us." Daniel withdrew his arm from her grasp, his expression hardening. "Dad recorded what you actually said, Sophia. Those were your words, your true feelings. The only wedge here is the one you've been creating for months." He turned to me, straightening his shoulders. "We'll follow your terms, Dad. All of them. This is your house, and we're guests here. I forgot that for a while, but I won't again." Sophia realized she had lost this battle. With Daniel firmly on my side, her position was untenable. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I need some air," she said, and walked out without another word. Daniel and I sat in silence for a moment, the tension gradually dissipating from the room. "Do you think she'll agree to the terms?" he asked finally. I shrugged, feeling oddly calm despite the confrontation. "That's up to her. But I want you to know that whatever happens between you and Sophia, you'll always have a home here." He nodded, tears gathering in his eyes. "I know, Dad. I've always known that." As we sat together in the study that had seen so many family discussions over the years, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. I had stood up for myself, set clear boundaries, and in doing so, perhaps saved both my home and my relationship with my son. Whether Sophia would accept the new reality remained to be seen. But for the first time since she had entered our lives, I felt as though I had reclaimed my power, my home, and my dignity. In the days that followed our confrontation, an uneasy peace settled over the house. Sophia maintained a chilly politeness when our paths crossed, which was infrequently. She spent more time away from home, presumably giving herself space to reconsider her position and options. Daniel seemed torn between concern for his marriage and relief that the underlying tensions had finally been brought to light. For my part, I focused on rebuilding the aspects of my life that had been slowly eroded during Sophia's campaign. I called old friends I hadn't seen in months, inviting them over for dinner or chess. The house began to feel like a social space again rather than a battleground, filled with conversation and laughter that had been absent for too long. One afternoon, my friend Thomas and I sat on the front porch, enjoying the late summer breeze and discussing a book we'd both recently read. As we talked, I realized how much I'd missed these simple pleasures, the easy companionship that comes from decades of friendship. "You seem more yourself today, Chris," Thomas observed, using the nickname only my oldest friends used. "More present. For a while there I was worried about you." I nodded, acknowledging both his concern and its validity. "I was lost for a bit," I admitted, "caught in a situation I didn't know how to handle." Thomas had known me long enough to understand the complexity behind those simple words. "We all get lost sometimes," he said. "The important thing is finding your way back." His wisdom, offered without judgment, was part of the healing process. Reconnecting with friends who knew me, truly knew me beyond the caricature Sophia had tried to create, helped restore my sense of self. Daniel, too, seemed to be going through a process of rediscovery. He began spending more time with me, helping in the workshop with projects he'd shown little interest in for years. One Saturday, as we worked side by side refinishing an old table, he broached the subject that had been hovering between us. "I owe you a real apology, Dad," he said, carefully sanding along the grain as I'd taught him decades earlier. not just for what happened with Sophia, but for how I handled it. I let you down. I paused in my own work, giving his words the consideration they deserved. You were caught in the middle, son. That's never an easy place to be. He shook his head, not accepting the easy absolution. I should have seen what was happening. The way she spoke to you, the changes around the house. I noticed, but I didn't want to acknowledge it. It was easier to pretend everything was fine. His honesty touched me deeply. We all do that sometimes, I said. See only what we want to see. Your mother was the same way about her sister Eleanor. Refused to admit how manipulative she could be, until that Christmas disaster of '92. The mention of Margaret and the family story brought a small smile to Daniel's face. He remembered the incident, how his aunt had finally shown her true colors, so dramatically that even Margaret couldn't deny it any longer. Mom could be stubborn, he acknowledged. But she was also brave enough to face the truth once she saw it. I want to be more like that. We continued working in companionable silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of sandpaper against wood, creating a meditative backdrop for our thoughts. Do you think Sophia and I can work through this? He asked finally, the question clearly weighing on him. I considered my answer carefully, not wanting to influence his marriage unduly, but also unwilling to offer false hope. That's something only the two of you can determine, I said. People can change if they truly want to, if they can acknowledge their behavior and take responsibility for it. The question is whether Sophia wants to change. Daniel nodded, accepting the ambiguity of the situation. I need to have some hard conversations with her, he said, about respect, about how we treat family, about our values moving forward. I felt proud of him in that moment, proud of the man had become, despite recent missteps. Those are important conversations, I agreed. Whatever happens, you'll always have a home here, and you'll always have my support. His eyes glistened briefly before he blinked away the emotion and returned to his sanding. I know, Dad. I've always known that. While Daniel worked on his marriage, I continued to maintain the boundaries Id established during our family meeting. I no longer retreated to my workshop when Sophia was home, instead occupying common spaces with quiet confidence. I reclaimed my morning coffee routine on the front porch, my evening reading in the living room, small assertions of my rightful place in my own home that collectively made a significant difference in how I felt. I also made sure to remain generous, despite the conflict, avoiding the temptation to become bitter or retaliatory. When Sophia's parents came to visit in September, I welcomed them warmly and ensured they had everything they needed. When her birthday arrived in October, I gave her a thoughtful gift, a first edition of a book by an author she admired, that Id found through a collector friend. These gestures weren't attempts to win her over or pretend the conflict hadn't happened. They were demonstrations of who I was and had always been. A man who believed in treating others with dignity regardless of circumstances. They were also, in their way, reminders that generosity stemmed from strength rather than weakness. The first sign of potential change in Sophia came unexpectedly, nearly 3 months after our confrontation. I was in the garden one Sunday morning, tending to Margaret's roses, when Sophia approached hesitantly. "Those are beautiful," she said, indicating the deep red blooms. Margaret's favorites, right? The fact that she remembered this detail, something Id mentioned once in the early days of her relationship with Daniel, caught me by surprise. "Yes," I confirmed. She called them her little drops of passion, said every garden needed something bold and unapologetic. Sophia smiled faintly at the description. "She sounds like she was an amazing woman." I wish Id had the chance to know her. There was a genuineness in her voice Id rarely heard before, an absence of the calculation that typically colored our interactions. We stood in silence for a moment, the buzzing of bees around the roses the only sound. "I behaved terribly, Christopher," she said finally, her eyes fixed on the flowers rather than meeting mine. "The things I said, the way I treated you and your home, there's no excuse for it." I hadn't expected this admission, hadn't really believed she was capable of such self-reflection. I remained silent, giving her space to continue if she chose. I got caught up in some fantasy of what our life should look like, she went on. The perfect house, the perfect decor, the perfect image. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what really matters, of the people behind the things. She looked at me then, her expression more vulnerable than I'd ever seen it. I'm not asking for forgiveness, not yet. I know I haven't earned it. But I am sorry, truly sorry for the pain I caused you. I considered her words carefully, searching for signs of manipulation or insincerity and finding none. Thank you for saying that, I replied simply. It means a lot to hear. She nodded, seeming to understand that reconciliation would be a process rather than an immediate restoration. Daniel and I have been talking a lot, she said, about our values, about family, about the kind of home we want to build together someday. Good conversations to have, I acknowledged. We have a long way to go, she admitted, but we're working on it. I'm working on it. With that, she turned and went back into the house, leaving me with my pruning shears and my thoughts. I wasn't naive enough to believe that one conversation indicated complete transformation. Change, real change, took time and consistent effort, but it was a beginning, a small crack in the wall of hostility that had divided our household. Over the following months, small shifts continued. Sophia made efforts to engage me in genuine conversation over dinner. She asked about my projects in the workshop with what seemed like actual interest. When Daniel mentioned our annual fishing trip tradition, she encouraged him to continue it, even suggesting they look for a weekend that would work with their schedules. I remained cautiously optimistic, neither fully trusting these changes nor dismissing them as meaningless. People were complicated, capable of both tremendous growth and disappointing regression. Only time would reveal which path Sophia would ultimately choose. What I knew with certainty was that I had found my way back to myself. By standing firm, by refusing to be diminished or displaced in my own home, I had reclaimed not just physical space, but emotional and psychological territory as well. The lesson hadn't come easily, but it had come at exactly the right time. I understood now what Margaret had meant in her letter, about standing up for yourself being necessary rather than selfish. By advocating for my own dignity, I'd created the possibility of authentic relationships rather than ones built on resentment and fear. On quiet evenings, sitting on the porch Margaret had loved so much, I often reflected on how differently things might have turned out had I continued my passive approach. I might have found myself in that retirement community, cut off from the home that held my history, watching from a distance as it was transformed beyond recognition. Or worse, I might have remained in place physically while continuing to shrink emotionally, becoming the useless old man Sophia had accused me of being. Instead, I had found my voice again. I had remembered my worth. And in doing so, I'd created the opportunity for genuine healing within our family, whatever form that might ultimately take. Life continues to unfold in unexpected ways. Daniel and Sophia are working through their issues, sometimes successfully, sometimes struggling. I'm giving them space to find their path while maintaining the boundaries that protect my well-being. My circle of friends has expanded again, filling my days with meaningful connection. The house remains standing, solid, and welcoming, as it has been for decades. If changes come in the future, they will be discussed and agreed upon, respectful of both history and the need for evolution. For now, it's enough that it's a home again, not a battleground. I've learned that respect isn't automatic, even within families. Sometimes it must be insisted upon, defended when necessary. That standing your ground doesn't have to mean building walls, that boundaries can create the safety needed for authentic connection rather than preventing it. Most importantly, I've learned that it's never too late to reclaim your dignity, to remind others and yourself of your inherent value. Age may change our capabilities, but it never diminishes our right to be treated with basic human decency and respect. What about you? Have you ever had to stand up for yourself against someone who should have been supporting you? How did you handle it? Share your experience in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for more stories about navigating life's complex relationships. Thank you for spending this time with me today. And remember that setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's an act of self-respect that benefits everyone in the long run.